Okay, welcome everybody to the last part of this first week Panopto lecture recordings, and in this part we will speak about frameworks for explaining cognition, and this is the longest part of all of them and probably also the most challenging bit to understand. However, I would really emphasize that this is would be very good to understand that, at least roughly, because it's how theories, these frameworks are used to present theories and things like that. So it's kind of a prerequisite for a lot of stuff which is coming in the following lectures. Okay, so in the time of cognitive psychology, a lot of frameworks have been used to explain how cognition, how the mind works. And these are, for instance, the information processing approach, production systems, semantic networks, connectionism. And there are more, but these are probably four of the key ones. And I think they are very well suited to show you how different angles this has been approached and try to explain. Let's start with the information processing approach. And if you remember, I said in a previous part that cognitive psychology arose roughly in the 1950s, late 1950s, and one key development what was happening at the same time was the development of the computer. At that time, computers were huge machines filling rooms and having ridiculously low processing capabilities as compared to today. However, psychologists very quickly tried to think about the analogy between computers and the human mind and tried to create these links between the two of them. And so this information processing approach is very much informed by this as well, by this mechanistic computer approach. Let's have an example of a task which has been in one form or another used very frequently in cognitive psychology, and this is a so-called speeded two-choice response task. So what does it mean? It's actually quite a simple task. Participant would sit in front of a computer, and on the screen, let's say a big L or R appears. And they have their two hands on the keyboard and have been assigned two fingers to press. When they see L on the screen, they press left button, and if they see R on the screen, they press the right button. Again, like in Sturmark's experiment, as quickly as possible. So participants have two choices, and they should respond in a speeded fashion. That's where the name comes from, speeded two-choice response task. And of course we can use all types of stimuli to respond to, all types of different responses, not only finger but also like verbal responses and things like that. And these tasks can be also made unspeeded. Then we look more at accuracy actually. Okay, so when we have such a task, cognitive psychologists have argued that what happens in the processing from presentation of the stimulus to the button press can be described in so-called processing stages. And the first processing stage is called the perceptual stage or perception. And in this stage we perceive the external stimuli. In this example, what we see on the screen, the letter L or R, and it's processed into an abstract code. So that for the next processing stage, it doesn't matter which font is used or which size it is, it's just this information, I have seen the letter L, no matter how it exactly looked like. So from this very low level, first, we detect features like edges in primary visual cortex to this abstract representation. The next stage then is response selection. And this is like a central decisional process, and it does something like which response is required by the stimulus. So just the decision, when I see an L, okay, look it up, I have to press the left finger button. And if I see an R, I have to press the button on the right. We could also mix the mapping and say if you see an L, press the right button, and if you see an R, press the left button. This so-called stimulus-response mapping, this is something the response selection works on. And the assumption is these stages work serially. So the perception stage has to be finished, and then the response selection starts and works on the output of the perception stage. And once we have decided on which response to do, we have to do the motor execution. So by actually programming our finger to move and the correct finger to move and actually press the key. And when we then have the response time, where we say left on the screen to button press, between the presentation and the button press, the response time, these processes are happening in these series. And there's a lot of good research showing that these are actually the key processes. If you look into more detail, you can identify even more processes, and you can make further subdivisions. So for instance, motor execution can be separated into motor planning and actually initiation of the motor act, just as an example. And there is good argument that it's around 7 or 8 stages which have to run through one after the other. But I think the basic idea is clear of how such an easy task can be described in this idea. Now, where's the relationship to what I said before, that it's information processing approach? You could say the perceptual stage is the input in a computer setting, so like keyboard, a mouse, or a webcam. Then the response selection, this is most similar to the central processing, like the CPU of the computer, the RAM, the working memory, the short-term memory. And the motor execution is equivalent to the output. So we can move a robotic arm, show something on the screen, print something out. So this is the analogy which is often done here and where it comes from the 1950s. And just to show you, this is an example from an actual research paper. This is exactly how it's used in publications. So this is, if you remember, I'm interested in multitasking. So this is an example where you have 2 tasks, 2 stimuli, stimulus 1 to stimulus 2. Both have their perception stages. And then the idea is response selection cannot work in parallel. So you do first response selection of the first stimulus. The second task has to wait, and then you do the response selection of the second stimulus. The detail of that doesn't matter. It's just to illustrate you that this is used in publications to describe how the mind works. Okay, so much for information processing. Another approach are so-called production systems. And that sounds maybe the whole description a little bit complicated. Basically, it's if-then rules, as you will see now. So a production has 2 parts. One part is the condition, and the other part is the action. So whenever the condition is satisfied or met, then the action is executed. So a very basic example, if the traffic light is red, then stop the car. So this is a production rule, if then. So we check for conditions, and if they are met, then we perform an action. And it becomes clear that this can be used to describe behavior. If there's a certain stimulus in the environment, or it can be inside us, like if I am hungry, then I'm going to eat. It can be more complex. If I'm hungry, and in addition, if I'm on a diet, then I'm not necessarily going to eat. Okay. The idea is that these conditions are tests on contents of working memory or short-term memory, so that the information which is checked needs to be processed centrally in this, in the last screen which we had, the central unit, the CPU and the RAM of a computer. That's the equivalence. So we need to look around and detect a red traffic light. And so we have recognized it, we are aware of it, so it's in our short-term memory and our working memory workspace. And then these conditions are working on them. And obviously, they may have further conditions, as I said. So if I'm not in the car and I'm just actually walking, I will ignore the traffic light, because it should be if the traffic light is red and I'm driving a car, then stop the car. Again, an example from a research paper, again from multitasking, to show you that it's actually used like that. So this is from a certain programming environment actually. So they use these production systems to simulate human behavior. So it's a computer program where you can program tasks like this and simulate what are the response time then if we do it like this, and try to recreate response times you observe in actual experiments. And when you see that your model does not meet or is not similar to the response times you observe in the participants, then your model isn't good. So you have to try to change something, maybe use some other production rules. You may have to add certain rules, or you have to remove certain rules or procedures, until you suddenly see, oh, now it does fit my observed response times. In this example, if, again, multitasking, if my goal is to do task 1, and if my strategy is to do task 1 immediately, and I hear an auditory tone, because task 1 is a beep task, high-pitched or low-pitched beep, high-pitched beep one key, low-pitched beep the other key, of 800 Hertz is on, so I'm hearing that. And there's a step do check for tone, so I'm actually trying to listen for a tone, so I am doing this task. Then send to motor, manual perform left index. So I should press the left index finger. Add this information, should be added to our working memory. Task 1 response underway, and this stays in working memory and may then be the condition for other if-then rules until I have completed the response. This is like add step wait for task 1 response completion, because it takes a while to press a button. And we delete from working memory that we should check for the tone of 800 Hertz, which was our goal to do the task, and that the tone is actually on. Again, you don't have to understand this. It's just to, in the sense of, oh, I would need to write something like this. No way. It's just to illustrate how cognitive psychologists tried to formalize how the mind works. That should just give you an idea of these things. These productions have been used to simulate a variety of things. We have seen the response, choice response tasks just before, but also, for instance, children's subtraction errors can be very well simulated with these type of production rules. Other example where it really fits very well is for procedural memory. Procedural memory is the memory for doing things like cycling or something like that. Learning it can be used quite nicely as well. Okay, taking a deep breath. So much for production systems. Now we change a little bit and turn to semantic networks, and they work a little bit different. And they come more from the area of memory research. And you will see in a moment why that is the case. So in semantic networks, we have something which is called nodes. These are the nodes, the circles here, and links. And the links connect the nodes with each other. The nodes stand for concepts. Here we have the concept of animal, the concept of skin, concept of the activity swimming, concept of fish. It can also be like abstract concepts like freedom or things like that. And the links, they illustrate the relationships between the concepts. So we have the concept animal, and we know animals have a skin. And we know a fish is an animal. And fish can swim. Things like that. So these links are labeled like this. There's very good support for the idea of the semantic networks from so-called priming experiments. And priming experiments are quite fascinating because priming in this context means a little bit that we manipulate the speed by which participants can do a task by presenting information which is technically not really relevant to them, which they are actually asked to ignore and not really process, but it still affects them. So the task is as follows. Again, speed it. They will have a target, for instance fish, and they have to decide, is the target a word or a non-word? This is an example for a non-word. So that's all they have to do. Again, 2 buttons. If it's a word, press the right hand. If it's a non-word, left hand, or the other way around. Now what is done now, you will see the target is seen for half a second. But before that, a so-called prime is presented. In this example, it's animal. This is presented for half a second, then half a second blank screen, and then half a second the target. Note that this is not subliminal. So it's not like we try to trick the participants or anything. We'll speak about this in a later session. This is fully visible to participants. We will just tell them you will see 2 words or 2 things, and the second thing makes the decision, word or non-word. Just ignore the first thing in each trial. Now, how does it look like on the screen? So participants would fixate the cross on the screen. They see the prime, it disappears, ignore it, and then target, press button as quickly as possible. Now this was one trial, animal, prime, target fish. Another trial may start with chair as the prime and then dog as the target. Now what is curious is that if this prime word is related to our target, then, like in this example, animal and fish, because the fish is an animal, then people are faster as compared to the second example where the prime is not related, chair and dog. And when you then do this in many different combinations and many different pairs of words, you see that this is a consistent effect, and this is the priming effect. So the prime, what is asked to ignore, affect our response times to the target. If it's related, we are faster. If it's not related, we are not faster. How can this be explained? And the idea is that these semantic networks have something which is called activation. And this activation can spread through the network. So, at the start of the trial, when we see just the prime, then this prime, animal in our example, will activate the animal node. Because we see it, so the representation in our mind is activated for it. Now what happens is that if one node is activated, its activity spreads across its links. So animal has a strong activation and then somewhat weaker, because it fades away the further you go away. You also activate skin and fish. And a little bit later in time, I don't know whether you can see that on your screen, swim will also have some activation. So it's shaded in a very light blue, but this will be lower than the one fish because it's further away from the animal. Okay, so this is the first part or step to understand how the priming effect works. The second one is that that there is the idea that to really identify a concept or to make a response, we expect the node to be activated beyond a certain threshold. So when I see fish on the screen as the target, the node needs to be activated beyond a certain level until our cognitive system says, oh yeah, I have this one node which has this very high activation, so this must be the target, I give a response. And if it's a non-word, I can't see any activation in my network, so I don't press a button. And the point is, because we have seen animal before and some of the activation already spread to fish and pre-activated fish, it starts from a higher level. When we now see fish, it reaches this threshold much quicker. So we are faster in identifying, oh, that's a word, that's fish, than that. That's what I just on the screen here what I just said verbally. So this is how the priming effect in a semantic network can be explained by the concept that activation is spreading from node to node. These semantic networks capture very nicely the associative properties of memory, so that everything seems to be linked with each other. And you probably know that. If you think of one thing, often related things pop up as well, or you remember them, something like that. Then these semantic networks can use the spreading activation, as we just said that, in priming experiments, for instance, but also, as we will see later in long-term memory, as so-called retrieval cues, where we say, oh, do you remember this one actor? Yeah, he played in that movie, he's married to that woman, and he's born in the 1980s, something like that. These are all retrieval cues which will activate certain nodes surrounding the actor, what you're actually looking for, until that one might receive so much activation that you actually find the link, the node you're trying to remember. Another example is the tip of the tongue phenomenon. And here the idea, one explanation, there are other explanations for this feeling tip of the tongue. You know it's there, but you can't really just produce it. The idea is that the level of activation for that node is just below the threshold. So you feel it's there, but it's not beyond the threshold so that you would actually recall it and could access it. Okay, so much for semantic networks, and let's turn to the last one, connectionism. And connectionism is probably the most complicated of the ones, and that's, in other words, nothing less than artificial neural networks. And these artificial neural networks, they usually consist of nodes, which are also called units, and which represent the neurons in our brain. So we have nodes here and nodes here, for instance, and then we have the links between the nodes, which are the connections, and they reflect the axons between neurons, so that information can flow back and forth between them. And there are quite further assumptions around that. Nodes and links both have activation, which is typically just as a convention specified as -1 and +1. And if the link is negative, it has an inhibitory effect. So if this one is activated and this is a negative value here, then this one will show a lower activation. Or they can be excitatory if their value, which is also called weight often, is larger than 1. So then if you have a 1 here, then this is higher than 1, for instance. And you would constantly update all the activation of the links at the same time. I don't want to go to too much detail here, but just to provide you with a quick example. So this is a little bit a very small network, and let's say we have two inputs here. And for the ease of things, we can say these inputs can either be 1 or 0. So we can have 1, 1, 1, 0, or 0, 1, or both 0. And then we have here some links to these so-called hidden neurons, and then we have one output neuron. And we could try to create a neural net as a classifier. This is very often done with artificial networks. For instance, to detect something. This can be image analysis. If you have many more inputs here, like the image of a webcam, and if it's much more complex, you could say, is it a car or a boat or something like that? Or much simpler with these two things, you could just say, okay, in my burglar alarm, I have the motion sensor outside on, and I have motion sensor inside on. So only if both are 1, I want to have this as 1, and if anything else, this should be 0. And then you can try to adjust these values so that you get this classifier outcome. And it's really very basic mathematics in this sense, that to determine the value of this neuron, you just calculate that. So we say 1 times 0.3 plus 0.3 times 0.5 plus 0.8 times 0.9 equals 1.44. And then you have something like, oh, the 1.44, when you train the network, is not what I expected with that input, so I have to change all these settings in between, the weights and so forth. And there are algorithms which do that automatically. And so during training, you just present different inputs, and if the output is as you like it to be, you increase the strength of the connections, and if it's in a way you don't like it, if it's not the right output, then you decrease the strength here. So you can do complicated stuff like that. Again, like before, you don't need to be able to create such a neural network or anything like that. I just want you to have a rough idea of how they are working and how they are used to represent the human mind, how they are used to represent cognition. This is just another example which shows you it's a bit more complex, and it can be tremendously more complex, and to make much more difficult things like visual scene analysis, like speech analysis, speech recognition and stuff like that. Okay, let us summarize this more complex section on frameworks. We have seen first the information processing approach, which was this computer analogy where we have the symbolic approach of perception, response selection, and output, like a flow chart. Then we have the production systems, which are basically if-then rules. The semantic networks, the one where the activation can spread, like in memory with priming. And finally now the connectionism, where we have complex learning, which we can nicely simulate that, and we can simulate perception. So one of the first applications to this is called the perceptron, because it was able in a very basic matrix to decide between a number of letters, to say which letter do I see in this matrix. So very basic character or text recognition. Okay, just I said that in the beginning, but just to make it clear once more, these frameworks have a couple of purposes, and one of them is that they are used to describe data, to summarize them in an efficient way. Because if you just have data, it's very difficult to say, yeah, I have this data point and this data point and this data point, but when I can describe something in a framework where then all falls into place, I can just say, well, if you remember Sternberg's experiment, if you can say, yes, with increasing set size, the response time increases by 40 milliseconds. That's so much easier as to say, yeah, and then if you add another item, it's again a little bit slower, and so forth. They also allow for generalizations, and it's funny how many curious findings have been or how many curious things about the human mind have been detected, not because people looked for it, but because they created a model, and then the model predicts something where you think, that's weird. If humans would never behave like that. So if that model and theory is true, if we do that funny experiment, people should behave like that. And people suddenly do. Then this is a strong support for the model, but it also shows you that you use some data to create the model, and then you use the model to predict potentially other data and other behavior. and then you detect things in the human mind where you haven't even thought about before. So it's really good for that. That's this prediction argument I just said. And also the generalization is the example of the Sternberg. Every 40 milliseconds, it's a new item you'd look for. And in the end, it's about understanding how our mind works. What are the underlying principles? So these frameworks are used to describe models and theories of the mind. And one theory is this idea of processing stages, that when we might say task, but in a more generic sense you may say action. It's this idea of perception. I have to select my response, I have to act upon it. This sequence of processes which happen in our mind when we do actions and try to do goals and fulfill goals, that we can describe that and understand that more properly. One thing which is really important, in particular in light of that you discuss a lot of these processes as well in biological psychology, is that the hardcore cognitive psychologist does not care about biological plausibility. In particular in the early years, these were really distinct approaches to think about. Nowadays, since 10-20 years, cognitive neuroscience has become very big, so there's a natural tendency even for hardcore cognitive psychologists to think about biological implementation. But when we talk about this in cognitive psychology, you're welcome to try to make the links, but it's not always possible, because people think that's a cognitive and mental process, and how it is realized in the brain, I don't know, and I don't care, you may say, as a cognitive psychologist. That's the question for other people. Nowadays, of course, we try to find theories where we have a nice link between the cognitive model and the biological implementation, so that you can join them together and they make sense as one theory and go along. And there are a couple of them, of course, where this can be nicely joined together and one informs the other. Yeah, basically all frameworks exist happily next to each other, and sometimes you have it that certain types of frameworks are used not at all in a certain area, because, as we said, semantic networks are particularly good for memory, so they may not be used for something else, and some others may not be used for memory. So there's not really a competition, but sometimes you have one phenomenon where you observed certain data, and then people come with different types of ideas, of models and frameworks to explain these data. And multitasking is an example where, for instance, people use this information processing approach of serial stages, and a competing idea is of shared resources, where we have pools of resources we can tap into at the same time or at different times and things like this. And these two models kind of compete, which is the better one to describe this phenomenon, the response times we observe in multitasking studies. And this is just then an empirical question whether the observed data support one model or the other model. Okay. Do you have any questions on this? Then, as usual, I suggest you post them in the discussion forum, and I'll try to have a look as regularly as possible and answer them. But maybe you can get into a nice discussion with your fellow students, which hopefully gives you an overall more interactive experience. This was the last part for this first week, and next week we will speak about perception and perceptual processes. And I hope to see many of you on Wednesday for our interactive session, which will be purely online. And otherwise then I will prepare the videos, Panopto recordings for next week's session Perception soon, so that you can watch them in advance. Thank you very much for attending, and see you on Wednesday or next week.